Now, let's look at some frequently used predictors in hiring. Let's start with various kinds of psychological tests. Probably the most common psychological tests used in hiring are cognitive ability tests, which tap reasoning, verbal and numerical ability, and problem solving. But the most popular IQ tests, such as the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, also known as the WAIS, or the Stanford Bennet, are individually administered, open-ended, and much too time-consuming for hiring purposes. Paper and pencil versions of these tests, such as the Wonderlic Personnel Test, are more popular. Here's an example of a cognitive ability test that measures verbal classification, verbal analogies, number series, equation building, figure classification, figure analogies. If you want to actually take these items yourself, you can pause the video and see if you can figure out the answers to these. Most of these tests measure both specific mental abilities, but also give you a total overall score, which refers to general intelligence, or G. Scores on general intelligence are related to performance on a variety of jobs, particularly complex jobs. This makes cognitive ability tests among the most valid of all the predictors. Criterion-related validity coefficients for these kinds of tests hover between 0.4 and 0.6, and we rarely get better than that for any kind of measure that we could use. In fact, general intelligence tests seem to predict performance better than more specific ability tests, or anything else for that matter. This seems counterintuitive at first, but keep in mind that many job duties today shift around over time. Someone with generally high cognitive ability may be better able to adapt to various and changing work situations and learn new things quickly. There are also plenty of tests which tap more specific knowledge or skills. Here's an example of a test of spatial relations designed for firefighters. In this item, the applicant is shown the front of a building and needs to identify which of the 4 options below would represent the view of the building from the back. A second example of a specific KSAO test is the Bennet Mechanical Comprehension test, which taps knowledge about tools and physics. Personality tests are now very popular as well, and actually they were very popular decades and decades ago, but they fell out of favor in the 1960s when behaviorism was popular and concerns about privacy were high. They were also misused often. For example, companies would use the MMPI as a personality test for hiring purposes, and this test is never designed to be used for that purpose. It's a measure of abnormal personality. As a result of these and other factors, companies stopped using personality tests for quite a while. In the 1990s, however, new research began to show that knowing an applicant's personality could add value to other information such as knowledge or skill in predicting job performance. One example of this research was Project A, which was a large validation study conducted by IO psychologists working with the United States Army. So now personality testing is back. It's desirable in part because cognitive ability tests, while they're very valid, tend to result in lower proportions of minorities and women being hired, which is a legal problem. In the 1990s, we also saw the Big Five model of personality emerge as a well-respected trait theory of normal personality, giving IO psychologists a framework for measuring work-related traits. So, you're probably relatively familiar with this, but just to go through it quickly, the Big Five is made up of 5 basic traits: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is sometimes referred to as emotional stability. You can see there's a helpful acronym there, OCEAN. All of these traits are possibly relevant for certain kinds of jobs. For example, being in sales probably requires a high amount of extroversion. But one trait in particular has emerged as being very useful for predicting performance in a wide variety of jobs. Can you guess which one? It's conscientiousness. Now, the most common test based on this model is the Revised Neo Personality Inventory, or NEO-PIR. But there are many others. For example, this is the 16 personality factor. Although it's not listed specifically as a Big Five test, you can definitely see overlap between the Big Five factors on the previous slide and some of the items here. For example, item 2 would relate to neuroticism or emotional stability. So that's just a sample of different tests that might get used in hiring. There are lots of other selection tools out there besides psychological tests. The most pervasive of these is the job interview. For most professional jobs, it's hard to imagine not going through at least one interview. Companies and management love the interview, and we have to make it as valid as possible because it will probably always be a preferred method of selection. So what are the advantages? Interviews are probably one of the best ways to measure communication skills and interpersonal skills. It'd be hard to get that from a test. In addition, the interview is a place for the interviewee to ask questions and learn about the job and the organization. In terms of disadvantages, as you might guess, there's a lot of room for either overt or subtle bias in interviews depending on how they're conducted. For a long time, researchers found that interviews were horrible in terms of predicting eventual job performance. Sometimes they predicted a little, sometimes not at all, and sometimes they even made things worse than not using the interviews in the first place. One of the most important findings over the last couple of decades is that whether interview ratings are valid or not depends on the level of structure in the interview. Interviews can be structured, unstructured, or somewhere in the middle. Highly structured interviews have the following characteristics. The interview questions are written out carefully in advance in the form of an interview guide. The questions themselves, the order in which they're given, and the way that they are phrased remains the same for all interviewees. And the evaluation method, in other words, how we judge how good somebody's answers are to those questions, is structured and consistent across interviewees and interviewers. On the other hand, unstructured interviews basically consist of the interviewer asking whatever comes to mind, some of which might be unrelated to the job in question. Structured interviews have been found to be valid in predicting performance, but unstructured interviews are not valid. Unstructured interviews also open the door for unequal treatment of applicants or unlawful questions. On the other hand, if the interview is too structured, there can be a lack of rapport with the interviewee, which can be damaging. So, oftentimes people like to have a certain amount of structure, but not complete rigidity. Let's talk briefly about different types of interview questions. Now you can ask factual questions that are relatively easy to verify, such as, how long did you work at your previous job? But here are two popular questioning techniques. In a situational question, the interviewer asks, imagine that X happens. What would you do if you were in that situation? So it provides a hypothetical situation that the applicant must respond to. A behavioral question would take the form of, tell me about a time when X happened, or you needed to do X. What did you do? So the situational approach is nice because it doesn't require past experience, which might disadvantage new workers. But the behavioral approach actually taps past behavior, which might actually predict future behavior well. Later on, we're going to talk about legal issues in hiring, but let's highlight a few interview questions that you might be asked and whether or not they're legal. If you follow 3 rules while writing interview questions, you will be on good legal ground most of the time. First, you should write questions that are only related to the job itself. So for example, what foreign languages can you write or speak? Is this legal? Well, it depends on the job. If you are talking about a job where knowledge of foreign languages is a crucial part of the work that the person would be doing, then yes, this would be a good question to ask. But if the person doesn't really need to know any other languages, then there's no point in asking this question. Second, every question you ask should be one that you could easily ask of all applicants. Here's one that wouldn't fit that. Who will take care of your children when they are ill? Now, you wouldn't ask this of anyone who didn't have children or you suspected didn't have children. This is also a question that people are more likely to ask women than men, and that's problematic. So if you look at a question and you wouldn't ask it of everybody, no matter what their gender or race or age or experience, then you might not want to ask it at all. Here's another example of a question that you wouldn't ask of everybody for obvious reasons. Questions about accommodations for disabilities can be handled after the fact, but shouldn't really be part of the interview. Finally, you shouldn't just ask something because you're curious about it. Even general small talk, while it might seem like a good way to build rapport, could open the door for bias. So, how about those Yankees? Well, if somebody says that they're a Red Sox fan and you're a Yankee fan as the interviewer, that could make it harder for you to feel good about hiring that person, or vice versa.